So I run a family farm just down the road here. It's been around for a wee while, and as you can see, they are quite hard to read at the back, so I will read it out. Farm was founded in 1864, 280 hectares of arable grain and seed production, 170 hectares of wood and shallow clay loam, 60 hectares of Temuka clay on clay, and 50 hectares of Wakanui and Templeton silt loam, which are apparently elite cropping soils, and I don't particularly like them because they don't have that grunt that clay soils have. So as I said, grain, seed and livestock, so we grow peas, ryegrass, linseed, radish, wheat, oats, crimson clover, vetch, mustard, kale and hemp. Not all of them in any one given year, but that's the range of crops we grow. I try to keep as long a crop rotation as possible. I think just talking, I've always considered myself to be conservation agriculture, and that's a legacy term, I suppose, and it's now sort of morphed into biological agriculture or regenerative agriculture, but it's based around no-tillage anyway. So on that, I think New Zealand is well placed to embrace change in agriculture, because it desperately needs to happen, and it needs to happen now, and it is happening now. And the reasons that we are in a good place for that is we have secure land tenure. Many places in the world, farmers don't have secure tenure of their land. They can be tipped off at any time. I think of an example I observed when I was in Indonesia about 30 years ago, when the palm kernel plantations or the palm oil plantations were being planted, and farmers were being removed from their land, either at the point of a gun or voluntarily, but I don't. And then they were shipped to far reaches of the country, so they couldn't form a collective and fight back. So, you know, we need to understand what a privileged position we are in New Zealand. Family farmers in New Zealand care about their farms. They want to leave it better than they found it. It's almost universal when you're talking to farmers. They say, I want to leave it better than I found it. We have a relatively good skill base and level of competency in our agriculture. The negatives, I suppose, are we have a lack of industry support, and vested interests are actually actively fighting any change, and I think we're not well represented in the government space. I mean, Federated Farmers and Dairy NZ are about as creative as a rock. So, you know, we're not getting any help in that respect. There's an absence of real science industry interest. We have outliers like Gwen and Murph, and not only them, there are others as well who are, you know, very passionately and interested in seeing change for the better, and actually have the guts to stand up and be counted. But the universities and you know, the CRIs are just basically sitting on their bums doing nothing in this area. The other problem that we're starting to see is this inadequate capacity and support in the advisory role around helping people to transition, and that's something we're actively working on at the moment, but we're sort of playing catch up. So to me, a healthy soil is a complex web of life powered by the sun and fed by plants. And I'm not really going to go into too much detail, but here we have, I guess, a very basic outline of what we might call the soil food web, and these are the various relative quantities of those organisms. I'm not going to go into detail on that now because I could speak for an hour on that. So how do I manage soil health, and how did I get to where I am? So our farm has had many enterprises, including dairy and sheep and crops and horses and all sorts of things over the last 150 odd years. By the mid-1970s, our soils were completely rooted. There's probably no other way to describe it. We had grey topsoil and yellow clay about 4 inches below, right down to the stones, another 12 inches below that. And so my father sort of thought, well, what can we do? And the option was to buy bigger machinery so we could just beat it that much harder. Or about that time, there was quite a bit of interest in no-till. The Roundup came on the market, so he went in that direction. Which is kind of interesting because he was a champion ploughman when he was at Lincoln, and you know, he was right into that. And I remember my brother said, Dad came home one day in about 1965 and he said, I hear that smoking's bad for you. So he stopped. So he did the same with the plough. So anyway, no-till was the way, and for the last part of his career, I suppose, it was just finding ways to make that work. But essentially it was a conventional system, and we just substituted in no-till, plenty of insecticides and burning the stubbles and all that. And we made, you know, we had a hell of a lot of spectacular failures, and we made a bit of progress. And I travelled away overseas for many years, and when I came home and decided to settle down and farm full time, I thought, well, how can we need to change this? And one of the things I was really interested in was soil carbon and energy flow through a farm system. And I sort of thought, well, you know, we've sort of addressed the energy flow through the farm system in terms of we're burning about 10% of the diesel that everybody else does to achieve what we're doing. So that was when I decided, well, we'll start mulching stubbles, and bought a stubble mulcher. I'd also got sick of contractors' drills. We started with a Duncan triple disc 730, I think it was the first one, with a contractor, and then we had an Aitchison springtime thing for a while, and then I developed my own drill after getting a very sore neck looking out the back window of the tractor and all the things I hated about the machine when it was sitting behind it. So essentially there we are. That's wheat that's harvested, and we mulch the stubble and then whip straight in with the drill. Now, as far as soil function and healthy soil is concerned on a cropping farm, your multi-species cover crops are the key, because it's difficult to have diversity when you're growing crops, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail shortly. So I've been using sort of 1 or 2 species cover crops up until about 3 years ago when I started learning about the value of diversity. And so we tailor make our cover crops, and there's an example of an all-winter cover crop, and you can see sunflowers in there. So that'll have oats, rye corn, rye grass, lupins, crimson clover, bursting clover, faba beans, phacelia, sunflower and buckwheat. So some of those things will die off as you go into the winter, but they've all been chosen because they have a particular root function or microbiome function that and they're all synergistic to each other. And this is our restoration phase. Those are grazed over the winter, generally only once, and not heavily grazed. And then the likes of here, terminating a cover crop prior to planting crops. So that was linseed was involved in that cover crop, about this high, and that was when I planted my first crop of spray-free radish in there last year, the year before, sorry. So that pretty much covers what I think helps make a healthy soil. So when it comes to getting diversity into the cropping rotation, now that's where it gets really interesting. So companion cropping for me is a way to manage crops to reduce or eliminate the need for cultivation and synthetic inputs. The challenge is to find compatible species that will enhance each other's growth and health, based on the principles of cover cropping, but constrained by the need to efficiently obtain uncontaminated grain or seed and maintain yield, which restricts the number and type of species that can be used together. So the main goals in that cropping phase are to use a mix of types. If the crop is a grass, we'll try and incorporate a legume and a herb, and that's based around root architecture and subsequent biological function that those roots perform in the soil. Plants drive the nutrition cycle in the soil. So for example, shaking like a sea dressing machine. Okay, I'm a bit out of order here. So yell into the thing. So just to follow on what I mean by being able to separate seeds in the cropping, so we can't have really multiple species, diverse crops, is here we've got oats and crimson clover directly off the header. Now that's really easy to clean out. It's pretty cheap to dress oats and crimson clover because they're really different shapes and sizes. So these three relate to this picture here. So there's this is oats, vetch and crimson clover together, and it's a little bit more difficult. The crimson clover is really easy to get out because it's so small, but when we machine cleaned this particular sample, we ended up with a nice line of still mix ready to replant. Essentially, we ended up with some very clean vetch and some vetch with very large oats. So it just sort of illustrates it's not that easy to machine clean seeds. So you just have to be very wary of that when you're cropping. Just the things are compatible to be separated. So here's an example of, and this is sort of an ongoing experiment. I only started doing this last year with the wheat. So we're growing. So last year it was crimson clover and Phacelia with wheat, and you can see here the crop's just coming into ear. The Phacelia is pretty much finished. The crimson clover is peak flowering or getting to the end of flowering, and the wheat's just coming into ear. And we were able to get that through. I did use one fungicide at the end because I was concerned that if we got disease in the crop and with such long withholding periods, that we'd be really in the poo. But as it turned out, probably didn't need it. So this year I thought, well, we'll try something a wee bit different. So I harvested a paddock of peas in late February, and it's an awful long time until May to have nothing growing in the paddock. So I ran a light rate of Roundup over after harvest just to clean up any problem weeds that were there, and I planted in Phacelia, crimson clover and buckwheat. And then at the beginning of May I went back with the drill, and with the GPS we have now, we could I inter-row planted the wheat between those rows, and that was it. So that was the beginning of May. It was quite cold. That came up in 5 days, which the crops that were sown in monoculture in the same soil at the same time took about 10 days. This was taken just a couple of days ago, so the wheat's now this tall. You can see here the wheat's this tall, but the Phacelia's that much taller, and it's completely canopied. You can't see the wheat over most of the paddock. But when we test the photosynthesis activity in the plants using using a refractometer to measure Brix levels, the Brix levels are higher in the wheat growing under the canopy than they are in the wheat growing in open ground by itself. So we're getting biological function, and so here you can see this was at planting. And the buckwheat, there is a buckwheat plant there, you can still see, so it was just about killed off with frost. This year I incorporated buckwheat as well as the other two species, because buckwheat's really good at mobilising phosphorus. So it dies off and is gone in the winter, and you can see the different root architectures. You've got crimson clover root, you've got your, what the hell is that? That might be crimson clover, and then there's Phacelia root in a mass here. And you can see the different types of roots. So that's the crop's going into a well-established root mat already. And these two, Phacelia and crimson clover, are synergistic with cereals. So they don't compete with each other, they actually enhance each other's growth. It's like they cooperate, and that's to do with that microbial activity in the soil. So this will go on. We'll probably graze this, I think, because the Phacelia has gone so far, and then it'll do its thing, it'll drop its seed, and it'll die, and the wheat will go on, and we'll only have wheat to harvest. The companion species will be gone, so we don't have any problem there. Because if you have contaminants in wheat, it's such a low value crop relatively that it's just not worth the process of actually dressing the contaminants out of it. So other possibilities are, there's wheat and Phacelia are only just with Phacelia, Here we've got oats and crimson clover, which was the material I showed you before that had been harvested. And here's planted on the same day, oats, vetch and crimson clover. So that's, and the oats were about a foot taller in here, which is kind of interesting because they grew that foot taller before then the vetch went nuts and just grew out the top. And there's at an early stage, and there's the crimson clover flowering. And that was just one Phacelia flower that survived through to air emergence in the wheat. And I asked you to question Hamish about pasture cropping because he said it was a bit of a disaster, but I actually think he was quite successful at it. So when he speaks after lunch, you can ask him about that. Other possible companions would be peas and oats, and I think Gwen had a slide about that being done in the States, but they're quite synergistic with each other as well. But the problem is convincing the people who grow the peas that it's a good idea, because it will add a bit of cost dressing out the oats. So there's a whole arsenal of things for people who are in transition, and I've listed a few organisms here that we all know that well, people in our game sort of pretty familiar with, because they're gold when it comes to, because you want to drop all the agrochemicals out of the system. So we start with various species of trichoderma, which is a fungus, and if it's coated on the seed and put in the soil, it forms symbiosis with the plant, and it can actually, well, as with most of these things, it can alter gene expression in the plants that host it. Oh, it's really cheap, it's about $5 a hectare. But it increases photosynthesis, and yeah, plus it helps with the plant fight off disease. It can be used as a foliar spray for fungal attack. Trichoderma can live pretty much anywhere, and I've got a photo to show you that shortly. Then we've got vesicular, robuscular and mycorrhizal fungi, which Jono mentioned before, or VAM, or mycorrhizal fungi. There's quite a huge range of types of mycorrhizal fungi. The particular ones we're interested in this, in the cropping scenario, or in the pastoral cropping scenario, is the ones that live inside the plant. So they're endomycorrhizal fungi, and they can increase the root surface area by up to 100 times in association with plants. So and they bring in phosphorus and all sorts of other things. Then we've got Rhizobiaceae, which are rhizobium bacteria essentially, that everybody knows are associated with legumes. What most people probably don't know is that they do form associations with the likes of wheat and other cereals. They can infect the plant through cracks in the root system, and again they will increase photosynthetic capacity. So that's something to be worked on, I think. And then there's another organism which is really interesting called Piriformis spora indica. It's a fungus again, an endophyte. And it was found in Hawaii because it can help plants endure extreme conditions. And they found them around volcanic vents, and these plants that were infected with Piriformis spora indica could tolerate temperatures up to 60 degrees in the soil. It also made them very drought hardy as well. And then they tried infecting plants with clean Piriformis spora indica and found that there was no advantage. So what they discovered, that if the fungus was infected with the virus and infected the plant, then it gave these attributes, so there was a multi-symbiosis going on. However, they haven't been able to grow it outside the lab in temperate climates, but the potential is, what they've observed in the lab is increasing disease resistance in barley by 70% and yield by up to 25%. So that's pretty spectacular stuff, once they identified suitable strains for our conditions. Then we have natural pathogens of Bovaria bassiana, Bacillus subtilis, Streptomyces lidicus, and Panabacillus poppiliae and Bacillus thuringiensis, which all can be used to control insects and disease. And these are all locally and commercially available products, biosolutions, Agron Technologies, and there's kelp from New Zealand kelp, and there's fish hydrolysates, which can also be used from United Fisheries and also from Biosolutions. We've got fulvic and humic acids that we can use to enhance nutrient transfer inside the plant, and also to buffer any chemical use that we have to use. So this is just an example. In the spray-free radish, one of the biggest problems is a disease called white blister rust. It's actually an oospore. It's a very primitive organism, and it has pretty devastating results on many plants, but especially brassicas. So here we have just the very first starting of the disease. And so that was taken the day, I actually jumped out of the tractor while I was doing it, took that photo. That was having an application of Trichoderma bacillus subtilis and Streptomyces liticus. And then 48 hours later, same leaf, and you can see the disease is almost gone. I suspect it's probably mostly the Trichoderma that's done that, but the other two, the Streptomyces and the bacillus, control other diseases that the crop is susceptible to as well, so they're quite useful companions, and I'm not a great believer in just putting one thing on. Just on Trichoderma, I'd just like to thank Alistair and Agram for these photos, but here's ryegrass seedlings that were inoculated. The seed was inoculated prior to planting and untreated. And these were pulled up probably 2 or 3 weeks after, once it just started to grow. But you can actually visually see an enhanced root mass on here. And if you can see it, if it's a visual observation that you can make, it's more than 20% difference. And this is just an interesting one. Alistair, I think he thought, well, what happens when you introduce Trichoderma to glyphosate? They just march on through. They don't really. Okay. We like that. They don't really give a damn. So just how do you make this work? So very briefly on just carbon in the soil. Initially, when I started, we were just focusing on building carbon in the soil. I thought it was all about the decay cycle. So putting the residues back on top of the soil, and the organisms would all, essentially the soil would digest that residue. What I've subsequently learned is that it's actually the living carbon cycle. Healthy plants in a healthy soil will develop rhizosheath, and this is caused by plants exuding carbohydrates from photosynthesis out through the roots, which then support the microbial life, and that gets that whole biocycle going in the soil, and that generates a huge amount of life, which then dies and deposits carbon way down in the soil. And so therefore now we're working on both retaining our residues, so we're getting our surface decay cycle, but we're also getting our liquid carbon pathway, if you like, down into the soil. So that rhizosheath development is pretty symptomatic of whether if you look at that and you haven't got it, your soil probably isn't ready. If it's highly contaminated with chemicals or whatever, and if you apply soluble salt fertilisers, you won't see it. So that's me. So there's a nice picture for you to look at.
Okay, so we had a text come through with a question, quite a good question for Simon. Simon, where do you source your seeds for these multi-species cover crop mixes?
I grow my own Phacelia, but it is available. Northwest Seeds.
There's a lot of locally available stuff as well.
Yeah, there's a few farmers. Murray Thompson and I often trade seeds. There's
West Coast Seeds.
West Coast Seeds. There's lots of seed companies around that do bits and bobs. Kate's, yeah, sorry, yeah, Kate's have got a few bits and pieces. So
within the discussion group that we have, we quite often trade and advertise seed stocks that we have. We also establish demand that is out there and then work towards those demands and having them fulfilled within the group, so to minimise that chain. That's just a new sort of innovation that we've been actively doing within the group. So farmers getting paid, beyond what they normally get paid for their seed, and then growers able to purchase that seed direct for a fraction of what they're normally having to pay. We'll go Nigel, and then we'll go Roger, and then we'll go Gwen.
Simon, I'm not quite sure why you want to separate out the cover crop seeds, because I bought some of you and we just planted them.
yeah, it's not so much the cover crop seeds. So the question was to do with why do you want to separate seeds out? Well, with the cover crop seeds, we don't necessarily, because they can be resown. But with all the other crops, it's necessary to have clean seed under OECD regulations for export. So it has to be clean.
Simon, I was just thinking back to a conversation we had at your kitchen table. You were talking about that crop of oats and tears being one of the most profitable through selling within the group over the whole farm period.
Yeah, well, it was also spray-free and no fertiliser, so it didn't have really any expenses. And it didn't get irrigated either.
I'll come back to you, Gwen.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, the seeds that you source, are they all neonicotinoid free?
Okay, so seed sourced, are they neonicotinoid treatment free?
The ones I grow myself are. Others I can't guarantee that they are. But I think it raises an interesting point about farm-safe seed. It's actually, because those symbiont organisms in the soil can alter gene expression in the plants, by keeping your own seed, certain seeds it can have advantages in terms of being suitable for your situation. And certainly it's interesting looking at buying wheat seed, because we plant all our seed bare, looking for wheat seed this autumn. All of the seed lines had disease loadings, whereas my own seed had no disease at all. So I actually ended up using my own seed this year because we couldn't buy good seed.
Got a question down the back here?
Yes, Simon, what's happened to your wheat population since you've done your companion cropping, or are you still relying on herbicides to get your tickle up?
Well, I'm not doing the companion cropping over the whole crop area, so we are still using herbicides. And the aim, part of the change in soil biology and soil chemistry that plants create also inhibit weed growth. So we get far less vigorous weeds, and that's a process that I'm working through. I'll still use herbicides if I need to get a crop at the end of the day. So, it's a process of learning at the moment, but definitely we see less vigorous weeds where we're stimulating the right sort of environment for the crop that we're growing.
What I've also learned through working with Simon is that he's very much shifted what his view is on weeds, and so a lot of the time, in my experience with you, Simon, is a lot of the weeds that people would normally go and act upon, you only act upon the ones that you know are going to be of concern to the crop.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the weeds that people often spend money targeting are actually a level of symbiosis that Simon's able to really embrace rather than spend money on terminating. We'll take one more question. We'll go Dennis.
Okay, Simon, can you talk about the issue of potential cross-pollination with some of your companion crops or cover crops?
Yeah, if you live in an area where you're cropping, do not, and I repeat, do not use daikon radish. It's the biggest several expletives of a thing you could ever put in. It's terrible. So, yeah, I think that was what you were trying to get.
Absolutely, Simon. Well done.
And Simon learned this the hard way. Yeah.
Why? Can you just explain to me why?
Because it will cross-pollinate with seed crops.
So only if you have hybrid radish growers in your area.
If you're in a cropping area, don't use it.
Because it has such a big root, it's so hard to kill.
It's a very tough thing, and the seed will keep coming back year after year after year.
4Ks isolation.
Yeah, and it's incredibly promiscuous.
So have you got something that could replace daikon radish with its root structure?
Yeah, lupins, sunflowers. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no problem not having it.